First of all, welcome everyone. Today's event has been about 6 months in the making. An introduction first. My name is Naomi Eisenberger, and I am the co-founder and the executive director of the Good People Fund, which is a granting body based here in New Jersey. We fund small grassroots programs in the United States and in Israel, and we also spend a lot of time mentoring our grantees, and it was actually, excuse me, through that mentoring that this entire issue of sexual harassment and fundraising was brought to my attention. One of our grantees, a young woman, called me one day in a pretty bad state because she had been accosted by a donor and wanted to share the incident with me and ask how she should deal with it, and had I ever heard of this. And I've been in the nonprofit field for about 25 years, and I had to admit that it was the first time that I had heard this. I consoled her as best I could, and then I did what I often do, and that is I started asking questions. And eventually I ended up at Martin Kamener's door. Martin and I have known each other for about 10 years, and he's an enormous resource for myself and for many other people. And I asked Martin if he had ever heard of this, and I have to say he was as surprised as I was. And that was the beginning of this entire process that we are going through, and hope we'll be able to raise so much more awareness of the problem. Martin and Stephanie Blumenkranz and the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, all of us working together have really made this possible, and I'm grateful to all of them for this. Martin has done a yeoman's job, and it was all of the research that he did that eventually led us out to San Francisco and to Dr. Richard Waters, who you will hear from. Dr. Waters is an associate professor at the School of Management at San Francisco University, where he teaches strategic communication and communication management courses. It was purely by accident that he ended up studying this phenomenon. And I guess if we've learned anything through this entire process, lots of accidents happen, and they bring good things with them. And I will pass it on to Dr. Waters, because I know that what he is going to present to us today is the first step in what I hope is a very successful process of eliminating what is a really serious problem.
That would be a great outcome from my perspective. I first have to say just thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. And also, you know, it's one of those that this is completely an accident on my part of stumbling into this topic. It's one that prior to going back and getting my doctorate from the University of Florida, I was a fundraiser out here in Northern California, doing healthcare fundraising. And it was a similar type of situation. It was just something that clearly was not expected, but had my own sort of situation that I didn't know how to handle with the donor. Didn't know what to make of it. didn't know where to report it, who to go to, because I was in an office of 3 people and I was the development team. And so this really sort of prompted my interest to look into this. And once I earned the degree, went into teaching, this became sort of a mandated section of my fundraising class that I teach in our Masters in Nonprofit Management program out here. And this is something that I hate to say, but unfortunately seems to be that kind of taboo topic in fundraising. And I woke up this morning and just did a quick sort of search of the major 3 fundraising associations. First one here, the Association for Healthcare Philanthropy. Do a search for sexual harassment on their website, and there are no search results. And for each of these, I did these a couple of times just to make sure I was actually spelling harassment correctly, in case that was the cause. But even misspelling it, nothing came up. So nothing from AHP. AFP, the largest association, was not much better. They had 1 hit, but when you click through to sort of see how they were talking about sexual harassment, it was kind of a side note thrown into this hot topic on diversity and inclusion. So it wasn't really addressing it at all. The largest one, CASE, Council for Advancement and Support of Education, had more, 20 results on sexual harassment. But again, it was all sort of focused on how sexual harassment is more applicable sort of in the general education setting and not specifically getting into fundraising. And this has been a significant problem that I've seen come back from my students who are out in the field, who are working in fundraising, some of them, some just looking to study and go into it. And so I know this is a topic that needs to be addressed, but for whatever reason, the nonprofit sector simply has dropped the ball on sexual harassment. And one of the things that being a academic, being that sort of quantitative researcher, I really like to quantify how big of a problem this is. And I've only ever been able to find 1 study that even looks at sexual harassment in this domain. And it was a study that was done in 2016 that asked British fundraisers their experience just generally in the workplace. And sexual harassment was just a few questions that they dove into in a much larger survey. But what they found was that of all the British fundraisers that that participated in this, and there were roughly 800 or so that participated in this particular study, they found that about 40% of female fundraisers experienced some form of sexual harassment. About 15% of male fundraisers. They made an interesting sort of note with the male fundraisers in that it is more often opposite sex harassment, almost a 2-to-1 ratio there for men fundraisers as opposed to same sex harassment. Didn't make any sort of note for the female fundraisers there. So I just wanted to acknowledge their heteronormativity there, not my own. But what they found was that it's most common in between people who are working for that organization. So employee to employee, manager to employee, board member to employee. But they didn't dismiss or downplay the role that donor begun sexual harassment played. About 1/3 of the incidents do stem from the donors, the grant makers, those various corporate foundation representatives that are interacting with our fundraising staff. And so when you take those numbers, for me personally, I wanted to try to see if I could extrapolate something from my decade of teaching my fundraising class. And part of the things that I do in this class is I require students to go out and talk to fundraisers near the end of the semester, primarily looking to see if the things that we've talked about over the course of the semester match what other people are actually living in this career. And so one of the things that I have them do is an interview with at least 2 fundraisers. And I give them questions to ask in particular. And you can see on the screen, hopefully, the 2 questions that I have them ask fundraisers as it relates to sexual harassment. The first one, how do you react to the statement, sexual harassment in fundraising is inevitable, given the imbalance of power between the donor and nonprofit? That generally gets quite a reaction from some. I've had student responses over the years from that one coming back, taking more of, the way that I sort of phrased it is more of a holier than thou type of attitude. Like, no, this cannot happen in the nonprofit sector. We're philanthropic, we're altruistic. Something like that happens on the corporate side, the for-profit side. And it not necessarily something that we expect or we see in the nonprofit sector. The second question, does your organization have a policy or training addressing sexual harassment? Almost universally, they don't. This is something that really hasn't been addressed often at all in the nonprofit sector. And so one of the things that throughout today, I would encourage everyone who's sort of on this webinar to do, if you have comments, if you have questions, you can click on the More option and bring up a chat window. And so if you have a comment or question, hit, I think it's, the label is to all panelists. If you can send that message, that comment, that question to us, we will see that on the windows that we have on our screens here, and we'll try to facilitate some conversation and discussion that way. I would love to know in that chat window if anybody does happen to have a policy specifically addressing sexual harassment in fundraising, because in all the work that I've done, I've not really seen that come out at all. It's one that most of the time when I hear that there's been some form of sexual harassment training, it typically has been focused on sort of broader employee to employee sexual harassment, or when it's tried to become a little connected to fundraising and external donors, that is sort of in that vendor relation role. So it's something that I don't expect many people on this webinar to have that sort of training experience, but I would love to know if you do, and so that you can also participate and give some advice once we get to some strategies later on. One of the things I found when sending my students out to ask these 2 questions, inevitably I get about 30 to 40% of students coming back that have stories of fundraisers who have been sexually harassed by donors, by grant makers, by corporate foundation representatives, community foundation representatives. And the overwhelming response that people have is that they simply didn't know what to do. That this isn't something that we train people. It isn't something that we necessarily address when people are onboarded to our organization. So it's difficult for people to really understand, how do I handle this? Especially if that organizational culture is promoting that donor relationship as really being sort of a one-on-one relationship between that fundraiser and that donor that they are interacting with. And so let me also just say up front here is that you will have access to all these slides. I've got the PowerPoint ready to send out because I've got some embedded links in a few of these slides so that you've got examples of policies and things like that so that you'll be able to connect to it. But so these are the sort of the sexual harassment, sort of the scope of it as we see it. And so one of the things I want to highlight, let me get back over here, is that when you look at sexual harassment, it's really important to understand the scope of what harassment can be. Certainly I think it's easy to sort of visualize the physical actions or the direct verbal comments that may be made to someone. But the legal sort of parameter of sexual harassment also goes into these indirect comments that may make someone uncomfortable in that workplace. And it may not even be a comment that they hear. It may be simply something visual. Maybe it is a advertisement, a Facebook post, an Instagram picture that's being used to describe the organization, describe an event. But if there's something in that portrays the body or uses language or sexually suggestive objects, it does cross that line into sexual harassment from that legal perspective. And I will say up front that my background is not from that legal parameter. I am a public relations, strategic communications scholar. That's where my domain has been. That's where my focus on sexual harassment has largely been, is looking at sort of the practical side. How do we take these strategies and lessons into the workplace? And in many cases, a lot of the strategies that I'm going to present in a couple of slides go far beyond what that legal requirement is. It goes beyond simply making sure that your organization is protected. Because ultimately, in that nonprofit, in that altruistic sort of environment, what we're looking for is sort of that compassion for everyone, the clients that we serve, but also those internal publics who may very well be sexually harassed from an external donor, from a board member maybe it's from someone in management. And we need to be able to know how to handle any of those situations that ultimately are going to present themselves. I highlight this cartoon in particular because it generally generates both chuckles in my classroom and a little bit of uncomfortability. And that really sort of outlines this problem with sexual harassment, because a lot of the examples, not the physical, not the direct verbal, but those indirect comments, those visual images, they may seem innocent to one, but ultimately, if that does make someone else in the office or in that workspace uncomfortable, all of a sudden, this becomes the organization's problem that they have to stop it. You can't have that hostile work environment coming about and impacting people and how they feel in the workplace. And so this is going to include those vendors that you may interact with, those donors, whether they're annual giving, special event attendees, major gift donors, the board of directors. Everyone is connected to this problem, perhaps, based on what may be an innocent comment, what may be a tweet that has been shared that has been taken the wrong way by someone. We have to be aware of what's going on. And this particular cartoon was highlighted in I believe it was a Drew Carey television sitcom show back in the early 90s that really stemmed from one of the landmark sexual harassment legal cases that helped define what that organization's responsibility is. And sort of the key finding from that case, or the key sort of ruling, was that when it does cross that line of comfortability, when it makes someone uncomfortable and senses a hostile environment, that's when the organization must step in and must make sure that they're addressing it. And there are several things that an organization really can do here to make sure that they're doing everything they can to create an environment that is going to downplay, or not downplay, I don't want to say downplay, but to help reduce the potential for sexual harassment. And the first thing that you have to do ultimately is think about what training your employees, your staff, your volunteers, your board, what have they gone through? It's one of those that here in the state of California, we are mandated to go through sexual harassment training, mandated by the state for all employees from any sector, that as long as we're over 25 employees. I looked up rules for the state of New York, and to my surprise, there were none. So it didn't appear, at least based on what I read, that New York State has any requirement for sexual harassment training. So it may not be as easy to find someone nearby since it's not mandated by the state, but I would encourage you, if it's not part of your organization already, think about the onboarding process with staff, with the board of directors, even with volunteers. This is something that you want them to think about, because ultimately this is something that you are responsible for, and something that is easily within your power to set this corporate or organizational culture, pardon the corporate term there, but you need to make sure that the culture is clear as to what sexual harassment is and that it's not going to be tolerated. And there are a lot of overlapping areas of concern when it comes to sexual harassment. So part of it has to do with making sure everyone understands what's appropriate. And I'm not trying to say that bullying is appropriate, but it does have a different sort of legal ramification. And once you have access to the PowerPoint, you'll be able to click on that bullying link, and it will bring you up a site that really kind of details what's the difference between bullying and harassment. It largely deals with how often it occurs, the intent behind the practice or the incident that's gone on, and whether or not the person who is the victim in this case is a member of a protected class. And sort of the best, well, I won't say best, the most simplified explanation of harassment versus bullying is whether or not, one of the best defenses is whether or not the person who is the harasser is open to harassing or bullying anyone. If they cross that sort of I'm a jerk to everyone, it sort of moves into that classification of bullying. There's quite a bit of legal back and forth as to whether or not something is one, the other, or both categories, but there is that potential for harassment to be harassing on one hand, but if that same situation happens to multiple types of people, then all of a sudden it moves into a bullying case. And there is no federal lawsuit versus bullying, or federal sort of guidelines as to handle bullying. There is with harassment. The other sort of thing that we have to make sure it is not sexual harassment is just preferential treatment. Whether this is done intentionally or it's done sort of subconsciously. There are managers, there are people in organizations that are going to have some sort of preference for certain employees, whether it is going out to lunch, whether it is sharing secrets of the trade, talking about social life, whatever it may be. Ultimately, this has been decided that this is not sexual harassment. Even though it may create sort of an uncomfortable environment, preferential treatment has legally not been seen the same as sexual harassment. So something that ultimately, again, we have to make it clear by going through the training and talking through things with our staff, with our board, creating that environment where they are open and willing to talk about these things, wanting to share what they're experiencing to make sure that we understand the nature and dynamics of sexual harassment. Once we've gone through sort of those initial conversations, it is ultimately up to that management team, whether that is executive director, whoever's responsible in-house, whether that is sort of a managed team, or the executive director, the board chair, you got to make sure that everyone understands that any form of sexual harassment, whether it's from within, whether it's from external sources, is not going to be tolerated. And ultimately, if you are not handling every single incident that's reported to you seriously, you suddenly become, I say your own best enemy here. You've thrown everything you've done to try to institute the sexual harassment policy out the window. Because once your organization isn't seen or perceived to take sexual harassment seriously, all the research on sexual harassment victims shows that they suddenly doubt all the reporting processes, doubt how you are going to handle that as an organization, and suddenly start to clam up about things that they're going through. And that ultimately can create some legal problems here. And I'm just looking here in the chat window. CEOs and high-level execs are subject to harassment because they are at the top, literally have nowhere to go. I'm going to talk about some of the reporting procedures here coming up shortly. And that's one of the things that the nonprofit is going to have to figure out what that reporting procedure is. But there are several things that the fundraiser, him or herself, must also do. And when I say fundraiser, we can broaden that to include a board member, a volunteer, a member of management. Anyone who is interacting with another individual ultimately has that potential to be sexually harassed. So they need to understand how this procedure ultimately is going to affect them. But for a fundraiser in particular, when they're out meeting with a grant maker, out meeting with a major gift donor, a corporate foundation representative, they need to make it very clear who they are, why they're meeting this individual, and the purpose of that meeting. There needs to be no gray area that this is a social connection, that this is not a business relationship that we're working on, that I'm here to introduce you to my nonprofit, let you know our successes, let you know our struggles, in future meetings. But every time that meeting happens, it needs to be made very clear with that donor what the purpose of that meeting is, so that it doesn't sort of blur that lines with that particular relationship. If that intent, we're here to interact, we're here to discuss a new program, a new service that we're offering. Once that has been declared, but something happens during that meeting that it does make that fundraiser uncomfortable, it is their responsibility to confront that harasser immediately and set boundaries for how that interaction, how that meeting is going to continue, if it continues at all in extreme cases. But if the harasser is not told, and again, this sort of gets into that intent, and was it an indirect comment? Was it something that was said that the intention was not to harass? In those situations, that confrontation, setting those boundaries, lets that fundraiser become empowered and really helps correct the direction of that particular interaction, that incident. Even if it's corrected for something that happened accidentally, it still, however, needs to be reported to the supervisor. Primarily because there needs to be a documentation trail for organizations, especially if it ever gets to sort of a legal matter. And so even when it feels, the fundraiser, that individual has to feel empowered to come back to the organization to let whoever they're reporting to know that it happened. Once they feel that that's going to run into a wall or not be taken seriously, if I am sexually harassed, overtly, accidentally, it's not going back to the organization. I'm likely to keep that in myself and not take it back to the organization. And so one of the things that sort of more broad sexual harassment training really tries to get individuals comfortable with is learning sort of the language of how you address and resolve conflicts. And I will admit that that is not my area of expertise. I see in the chat, young fundraisers need language for how to confront the harasser. Absolutely. It's something that, again, should be part of that training that fundraisers and staff and board all go through. That there should be not just here's who we are, here's the things that we do for the organization, for our clients, but here is what some conflict resolution skills and how to handle that should be woven into that training. So that's ultimately going to help not only those sexual harassment, but other issues that may come up as well. Once that gets reported back to the organization, whether or not that fundraising, that sexual harassment it was accidental, and both sides, the fundraiser and the donor, have acknowledged it, have apologized and corrected that situation, or whether it's been something that ended that particular meeting, the fundraiser felt threatened, uncomfortable, and decided to stop that meeting and move on. It still needs to be reported, and the organization needs to move into its sort of protection mode. So ultimately, there are a couple of things that nonprofits must do. They can never pressure a fundraiser to socialize with anyone in particular. Now, if there's a favorite donor, a board member, really anyone who they may come in contact with, there can't be that sort of mandatory pressure. You know, if you're going to have required meetings with donors, never send that person by themselves if they are feeling uncomfortable in a situation. Personally, you know, I would say that if I am a fundraiser and I am feeling uncomfortable in a relationship with a donor, even if it's just to go out and give them program updates, I personally would never want that to happen if they've been sexually harassed. Even if we've restored the relationship and it was accidental, I would want to move that fundraising relationship onto a different gift officer. You know, because once you've sort of introduced sexual harassment, even accidental, the nature of that relationship is going to change. So I would never force this upon any fundraiser to go continue relationships. You do have to empower fundraisers, staff, volunteers, board of directors to be open with this conversation. You know, that's going to include the training, but it needs to go beyond that so that this becomes part of the organizational culture. I need to have these sexual harassment conversations regularly. And one of the strategies that one of my former students has implemented in their own organization is that they regularly have what they call mandated asks. Basically, when the person who is their supervisor, depending on the level in the organization, just goes and asks the people that they're supervising, whether it's the annual giving team, whether it is people who are working in grant writing, you know, how are you doing in terms of sexual harassment? Are there any situations that are making you uncomfortable? And it's something that it may seem awkward at the start, but it's something that as it becomes ingrained in that organizational processes and culture, becomes something that is part of who you are. It becomes natural, and it's not something that is going to make people shy away from reporting it. That openness, that willingness to talk about it becomes quite important. Here's another sort of comment from the chat. How do you handle it when it's a small development team and there's no one else to handle this major donor? Do you move it up to the executive director or someone else? This is something that nonprofits are going to have to sort of decide for themselves. When it is that small development team And I would say I was the only one. Excuse me, my cat is knocking at the door over here relentlessly. When I was that one person in charge of development for my nonprofit in the situation, I was done with that relationship, and I made the executive director take control of that particular relationship. There were a time or two when the two of us went on meetings together in that transition period, but I let that relationship go as an individual. As that fundraiser, I could not be the one to be held responsible for cultivating it. And so organizations need to have sort of a backup plan. If it's not another staff member, the executive director, could it be a board member? Could it be a volunteer? Could it be someone else? And again, for these major gift relationships, these are things that we should hopefully be thinking about anyway, because I could decide next week that I'm done with the organization, that I'm moving on to a different nonprofit to work with, or hopefully not, but I could perish in some sort of accident. And I don't want all my relationships with my donors as the organization to be in the hands of one fundraiser or a small team. I want them spread throughout. And so maybe it is an executive director. Maybe it is a program officer, a program manager. Maybe it is that board member, but I need these multiple touch points for that particular relationship. Once an incident gets reported from a fundraiser or anyone in that organization, legally, the nonprofit has a responsibility to act quickly to address it and ultimately take corrective actions. So they've got to do their own investigation, talking to both sides. And again, once this accusation comes about, it is going to create some feelings of uncomfortability between that donor, between that fundraiser. And so we have to be prepared for some sort of consequence. It may be that that donor decides they're never giving to our organization. But that ultimately is something that we have to acknowledge in this environment with sexual harassment. We have to take it seriously. We have to follow up. Hopefully through our investigations, we're able to come to some resolution. Hopefully it's a positive resolution on both sides, but I need to make sure that as I'm doing that investigation, I'm documenting everything, that I'm making sure we keep detailed records so that we can put it in our files, so that in case there ever is some sort of legal action that's taken, you have sort of covered that organization. You do need to report back to both sides. And again, my sort of caveat there is I would never try to restore that relationship between the fundraiser and whoever that harasser may be. I think you're asking for trouble. I see it best to try to move that on to an executive director, another staff fundraiser, somebody else within that organization. The other thing that I would say that sort of to set the tone for sexual harassment conversations within an organization, not only is the training important, but anything that organization does in relationship to sexual harassment must be written down. If it's not written down, it might as well not exist. It's those written policies, the things that we can point to in manuals that are part of our organizational culture that really help reduce this environment, because I know it's going to be treated more seriously than if I have to go back and think about, well, when was the last time we had a situation come up and what did we do then? I need to be able to point to it in our manual, in that onboarding sort of session. Looks like another comment has come up here. Best practice is that when action is taken by management, only the victims and harasser in that communication loop. Absolutely. So how do you deal with org pressure from some to communicate the management actions widely to all staff? I think it really gets into the level of communication and the amount of details that you are going to share. I think those details certainly become much more, details become detailed. That you share more information with the two parties, because again, ultimately thinking about how that may come out in a legal type environment, you want both sides to know what has been said and what the reporting what has gone on within the donor, within that fundraising relationship. Other members in that organization who may hear rumors, who may have heard that an incident is going on, you want to make sure they know that it's moving through the channels, moving through the investigation, moving through the documentation phase. But they don't need those finite details that really get into what happened with the harassment or whatever the corrective actions may be. They don't need those specific details. So let's just say if it was a employee to employee sexual harassment scenario, and maybe this has been something that has happened for a while. We have a zero tolerance policy. The final corrective action may simply be letting that person go from the organization who was the sexual harasser. And in that situation, other staff, other employees, sure, they're going to need to know that this person has been relieved of his or her duties, but you don't need to get into the specifics as to what actually prompted that sort of dismissal. Same thing with a donor. You know, if I'm going to be reassigning a donor to another fundraising officer or to someone else in the organization, I don't necessarily want that to paint a picture for whoever is going to be working with that particular donor. You know, maybe that donor decides to leave the organization for good, and that's something that I may want to report. But I don't want to get into sort of the details of the he said, she said, he said, she said, whatever sort of parameters or how sexual harassment comes about. It's one that those very specific details need to be kept on sort of a need to know basis. But you do need to take that appropriate corrective action and ultimately making sure people know that the policies have been sort of followed. Now, these particular suggestions here are ones that I've kind of gathered from interviews that I've had with fundraisers who are in the field. This is a sabbatical year for me, and I'm taking this year to really kind of dive into sexual harassment in fundraising a bit more. And so this is one of the main projects that I'm working on here, is to come up with kind of these policies and procedures for nonprofits to deal with fundraising and sexual harassment. So a couple of these are ones that I think generally should just be kind of best practices for donor recruitment and donor sort of relationship management broadly, but they do help eliminate that potential for sexual harassment. So one of the first ones is that anytime you're meeting with a donor, it really does need to be done during those traditional business hours. There's really no need for dinners, for weekend meetings that are not at a special event that the nonprofit is throwing. But those things really need to, meetings one-on-one certainly should be done in business hours. There shouldn't be any alcohol consumed during the meeting, preferably all parties, but certainly donors, if we're meeting at a restaurant, have the ability to order whatever they choose. But for those representatives of the organization, there should be no alcohol consumed, so you don't accidentally put yourself in a position where you may be somewhat more susceptible to sexual harassment. I would say that two people from that nonprofit should always meet with that donor. It shouldn't just be a one-on-one type of scenario. I need to have an executive director, a board member, someone who is connected to that donor, who is sort of a mutual acquaintance. I need more than one person representing that organization. If an organization is small, they don't really have the ability to have two people go out and meet that donor, then I would say that a fundraiser should never meet that new donor alone. There should always be someone there when that relationship is initiated other than just the donor and the fundraiser. I need that other person, again, to help establish those boundaries, maintain a professional nature about this relationship. I need an organization to go back and look at its own policies in regards to gift acceptance. And typically with gift acceptance, what we think about is what gifts are we willing to accept from donors as an organization. So am I taking a used vehicle? If somebody has artwork that they want to donate, am I taking that? But I would say the gift acceptance policies need to go one step further, because there are many situations and kind of leading into that realm of sexual harassment where donors offer a fundraiser that they've been working with, come stay at my timeshare down in Florida for vacation. In the course of discussions, it comes up what plans are. I've got a place in Florida you're welcome to stay at. I've got a vehicle that you can borrow to get around to meetings. Any sort of gift of that nature needs to be addressed in policies, primarily because fundraisers often come back based on the interviews I've done and saying, I didn't have something that I could point to from the organization and say, no, I cannot do this. Same thing with sort of that next one, having a policy that forbids non-business related meetings without other representatives present. If I have got that policy in place and you as a donor have invited me to attend another event's gala because they want to introduce me to another potential donor, or they want me to come to a family function. I've been invited to weddings and other things that I didn't understand why I was invited there for, other than I was being asked to basically be their escort for this particular event, so they weren't going alone. I need to have policies in place that my employees can point to say no, because as that fundraiser, they're looking for that kind of protection, especially when we're working in this realm of expectations that I'm supposed to bring in X number of dollars to the organization per year, or I need to have this number of interactions with donors. So it's important to have policies that they can say, I can't do this, my organization doesn't allow it, without damaging that relationship that they're working to cultivate. You need to have a policy in place about what's appropriate touch and conversation in the workplace. This particular link will take you to, I believe it's a CNN or a Fortune story that kind of gives you some suggestions for what is appropriate and what is not, especially thinking about pats on the shoulder, hugs, handshakes, those sorts of things. And we all have our own different comfort zones. So a lot of this gets into what does it appear that donor or that individual is comfortable with, and how do we kind of work around that? I need to make sure that ultimately, again, everybody's feeling comfortable about sexual harassment, and part of that gets into this thing that we mentioned earlier with mandated asks. I want to reiterate here because I can't understate this. If your policies are not written, they do not exist. And the policies have to be more than just written. It's kind of my follow-up here. I need to do everything I can to make them public. And I don't just mean let's stick them on a HR bulletin board. I need this to be part of the organizational culture. So we have to discuss it. We have to make sure that this becomes something that we are free and not scared to talk about. Because again, if 1/3 of incidents of sexual harassment are coming from our donors, and nearly 40% of, again, those sort of British fundraisers, around 30 to 40% of the fundraisers that my students have reached out to, they have experienced some form of sexual harassment. And so I need to make sure people are comfortable about talking about what they're experiencing, and that we as an organization are enforcing those policies. Because if we're not enforcing them, all of a sudden, you know, that one exception, because this is what Jim likes, or this is what Valencia has always done, those things, they throw everything that we're doing to try to make this part of the culture thrown out the window. You know, let's see, if the only data available is a 2-year-old UK study, which might be dismissed in the US, do we have any expectation that there will be more current data that is US based? I would love to see that happen. Part of it, I've been shot down by CASE and by AFP for doing a survey of their membership. I think it's going to take time to get that more recent US data. I've got some associations that I'm working with here in the Bay Area, some foundations, but it is something that this is not something people want to talk about. So the data and the access are certainly problematic with making this more well known. Somebody asked earlier about what happens in a small nonprofit. You know, if you don't have a large staff, or if it is the executive director or the management team who may be someone who's doing the sexual harassment. One of the things that you have to do in making people comfortable with reporting it is to have some sort of form that someone can fill out anonymously. The report incidents link will take you to a sample form there. You need to make sure people know how to access that. And it can't be one that I have to go request the form from an individual in their office. It needs to be made available anonymously online. They need to be able to mail that in, file it online anonymously as well. You need as much detail as you'll see in those forms as you can request from people. The more they give, the better off you will be in sort of documenting and following up with a report. But you also need to think about who they're giving that report back to. And I want to make sure that it's going to that I have multiple people that I could turn to. I don't want it just to be one person in HR, or if your organization doesn't have an HR department or an individual, that I have the potential to send it to a board member or the executive director, or whoever is put in charge of this. So this should be something that, again, is thought through by the organizational governance team, and sort of how we're going to work through some of these. As you get through that form, start reporting it, you need to make sure that you're doing everything you can to handle it professionally, transparently, and make sure that details are conveyed only when appropriate. And to the appropriate people. Here we've got from the chat window, if they file a report anonymously, how can they be interviewed or their claim investigated? It may be that what they're reporting, they may not want that anonymity. You know, give them the option to keep that anonymous. It may be that I'm observing sexual harassment going on and I want to report it. Maybe it is a donor who I saw treat a staff member very poorly at a special event. They may not feel comfortable reporting it, but if I saw it, I should be able to report that anonymously. And ultimately, it's one of those things that as a fundraiser, I may not feel that I can report it. You know, and that gets back to that organizational culture and how seriously we're taking this. And it's part of building that culture up so that when they do report, maybe that they're willing to give their information. And, you know, I think one of the questions on that report form, you know, do you wish to be contacted? And, you know, if so, provide that contact information, provide, you know, how you're most comfortable talking with it. you've got to sort of take that form and adapt it to your own sort of working environment. And I'm kind of going to wrap up here on this last slide. The one article that I read about sexual harassment in fundraising in the Chronicle of Philanthropy comes from Arminda Lathrop. She's a consultant down in the Washington, D.C. area who did kind of a general discussion of sexual harassment and what we need to be aware of in the nonprofit sector. I think this quote perfectly encapsulates sexual harassment with donors in that fundraising sense, because this is very much focused on that one-on-one relationship between a donor and that fundraiser. Fundraisers genuinely are going to take interest in others. And I don't want to go so far overboard with training that it hinders what they're able to do as a fundraiser. But I also don't want them to feel trapped in that sexual harassment environment. And so I think coming up with a healthy training, a healthy sort of policy for an organization to abide by will ultimately make for a much more favorable working environment. And I know that there are a couple other things that have come up here in the chat window. I want to make sure that you've got my contact information just in case you wanted to follow up offline here. Managers should understand that they cannot keep a report of sexual harassment to themselves. They must report it to the identified parties. The policy must make clear that you cannot investigate an anonymous complaint and can't make it better unless you mention the observed behaviors. Yeah, it is one of those that policy does need to sort of outline what the process is. And I think on that sample report form, it will show you a sort of step-by-step. This is what we are going to be doing as the organization to follow up on this. You as that organization, again, legally want to show that you have taken these actions to create or to eliminate this hostile environment, that you've done what you can to make it something that is going to be less likely to promote sexual harassment. And again, these details are needed. The follow-up is needed. If you have witnesses, that's something else that the report sort of asks for. All of this is helpful in making sure that your organization ultimately is free from sexual harassment.
I want to thank you, Dr. Waters, for the past hour, and I know I have been listening with rapt attention. Everyone who is here, thank you for being part of this. All of these slides will be available. We will be emailing everyone with access to the slides, and I know that there will be further information down the road. And thank you everyone for your time this afternoon. I think this is the beginning of a long road.
And again, I would say, please, if you have comments, questions, please feel free to reach out. I will do my best to answer them as best as I can and in a somewhat timely manner, given that I don't check email necessarily every day.
That's a great habit. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.